Now we get to some more interesting stuff, which is what happens when there's interventions in this beautiful market we've laid out. That is, we've laid out this lovely market where supply and demand shift around until they're equal and you get to this equilibrium, and all is good. Okay? But what if that isn't the case? What if there's some barriers to supply and demand achieving this new equilibrium? And we're going to consider two cases. Perhaps the most famous case we'll talk about is the minimum wage. I'm sure you all have heard the term of the minimum wage. Perhaps many of you have earned the minimum wage. Okay? This is a regulation placed by the federal and in some cases state governments on the labor market, which sets a minimum wage that people can be paid. You cannot be paid below the minimum wage unless you work in certain service sector jobs where there's a sub-minimum wage. But by and large, you cannot be paid below the minimum wage. Okay? Now we're going to analyze what effect that has. Now to do that, we've got to step back for a second because we're now moving to a new market. And it's a different kind of market. I'm going to have to sort of bend your mind around this a little bit. Because we're going to move to a market where now you're the pork. Okay? Where now the good being sold is you. In particular, your labor. So now we're going to turn to the market for labor, which we see in figure 2.4. In the market for labor, the good is now produced by you. It's the amount of labor you produce, L. That's on the x-axis. The price is now the wage you earn. So now instead of you going to the shop and buying something, the companies are coming to the shop and buying you. Okay? And they're buying your time at a wage W. So now the supplier is you, and the demander is the company. We flipped it around from the pork example. All the examples you learned on Friday, all the examples learned so far, the consumer is you, and the supplier is Apple or some company. Okay? Now we're flipping around. Okay? Now the supplier is you, and the demander is Apple. Okay? So in that market, the demand curve, once again, that doesn't change our fundamental structure. The reason I move so quickly with this kind of example is to help you understand these basic tools can be applied in any framework. The demand and supply curve notions haven't changed. Demand still slopes down because the higher wage you want, the less of you Apple wants. Okay? The fewer hours you want. And the higher wage Apple pays you, okay, the more you'll work. Okay? So demand curves still slope down because the higher wage, the fewer workers firms want. And supply curves still slope up because the higher wage, the more you want to work. But now the market's flipped around. And we have a new equilibrium where people are willing to work L star hours for a wage W star. Okay? Questions about this sort of inversion of the problem? All right. So now we're in some equilibrium. Now let's say the government rolls in figure 2.5 and says, no, we don't like that wage W star. We think there should be a minimum wage that's higher than that. We think that you're being exploited, and we think there should be a minimum wage that's W lower bar in figure 2.5. And we call this a price floor, because in this case, the price being paid is the wage you're paid. So we call the minimum wage the price floor. So I think there should be a minimum wage at W lower bar. And we're going to impose that. What does this do? Okay. Well, let's think about both sides of the contractual decision here. Think first about you. I come in and I say, you are going to earn W lower bar. How do you decide how hard you want to work? Well, you go to your labor supply curve. You say, well, gee, at W lower bar, I want to work L sub S. That's a great wage. I'm happy to work hard at that wage. Sign me up. Now let's think about the firm. They say, well, at W lower bar, I don't want that many workers. Okay, as we'll see in a number of lectures, I'm going to substitute to machines instead. Okay, because it turns out firms don't just have to hire workers, they have machines. And so firms can say, I'm going to substitute to machines instead. I don't want that many workers, or maybe I'll just shut my business down or whatever. But I certainly don't want to hire that many workers. Indeed, at that high wage, I only want L sub D workers. So now what do we do? Well, so now what we end up with is we end up with an excess supply of workers. L sub S minus L sub D. also known as unemployment. Okay? A term you've also heard, maybe even experienced. Okay? Now, before we said, well, when there's excess demand or excess demand, the people just adjust and you'll wiggle and waggle and get to the new equilibrium. But you can't here, because the government has said you can't pay below W bar. So you're stuck here. Okay? You can't move from here because you're stuck here. So what we'd like to have is firms would like to go to workers and say, you know what, workers, look, you'd be happy to work. You'd be happy to work an amount L star to wage W star. I'd be happy to hire you an amount L star to wage W star. Let's just strike a new deal. And workers would like to, but they can't, because you have a situation where you're at W lower bar. Now, does that mean there's chaos and a breakdown of social order? No. In fact, the labor market still functions. Okay? Indeed, the labor market achieves an equilibrium. It's just an equilibrium with excess supply. So the way to think about this is, you've got a situation, you tell me, what's the new equilibrium? What is going to be the new equilibrium amount of labor hired? We know the new equilibrium wage is W lower bar. What's going to be the new equilibrium amount of labor that's hired in the market? Someone tell me. Yeah?
L sub D.
L sub D, why?
Because that's like, because it can't go anywhere else.
Yeah, well, basically the firm decides how many people they're going to hire. People can bang on the door and say, hire me at this high wage. Screw you. I'm the firm. I got LD jobs. We're done. Okay, so we get a new equilibrium. The new equilibrium is at a labor amount of L sub D and a wage of W lower bar. So there's no chaos and breakdown of social order. You get a new equilibrium. It's just an equilibrium that features excess supply. Now, without a government intervention, you'd never have an equilibrium with government excess supply because the market would equilibrate to a new outcome. But here it can't. So you're stuck at this outcome of L sub D with a wage W lower bar. So basically, the point is, when you have a situation like this, with an intervention which doesn't let the market adjust, the outcome is determined by the constrained party. The constrained party here is the firm. Workers are happy to work this amount. Firms don't want them, so they determine the outcome. So let me ask a question. What if I set a new minimum wage that was below W bar? What would happen? Someone raise their hand and tell me. What if I set a new minimum wage that was below W bar? Yeah? Maybe. Maybe not. What else? Yeah?
Depend on the level.
I said it below W bar.
Yes.
So let's say it's $1 below W bar. Yeah?
It wouldn't move up to market equilibrium here because it could wiggle waggle.
Exactly, the wiggle waggle principle. I'm going to patent this one. Okay, basically the point is the market, if the market can get to where it wants to get to, it will. A minimum wage below the market wage does nothing. Because the market is happy at the market wage. The market is happy at W star. So the government comes and says, we're doing this great thing which sets minimum wage. We're like, fine, whatever. But we're happy at W star, so we're just going to ignore your minimum wage. We're already paying above that. The point is, if the intervention doesn't interfere with the proper function in the market, it does nothing. It only does something if it binds the market, if it constrains the market in some way. Okay? So the competitive equilibrium, the equilibrium without interventions, is always the place the market wants to go. And it will always go there unless the interventions stop it from doing so. Okay? Questions about that?